She looked him dead in the eyes. Seoul's most wanted man. The billionaire every woman in the city had lost sleep over, and said the one word no one had ever dared say to his face. No. Not politely. Not with a blush. Not with the apologetic, fluttery hesitation most people use when they're terrified of offending someone powerful. Flat. Final. Like she was declining a mediocre appetizer. And Lee Jae-won? He smiled. Slow. Dangerous. The kind of smile that should have come with a warning label. Because no one had ever told him no before. And something in that word, in her, cracked something open in him that he hadn't even known was sealed shut. The night Georgia Hayes walked into that room, she wasn't thinking about impressing anyone. She was thinking about the distribution deal she needed to close before midnight, the sample shipment held up at customs, and whether the caterer had actually followed her instruction to keep the pork away from the main spread, because she'd specified that twice and nobody ever listened the first time. She was working, which is why she had exactly zero emotional bandwidth for what walked through that door at 9:14 p.m. She felt it before she saw it. A shift in the room's atmosphere, like a change in air pressure before a storm. The low hum of conversation didn't stop exactly. It just rearranged itself. Voices dropped half a register. Laughter became more deliberate. Shoulders straightened without their owners realizing. Georgia glanced up from her champagne glass, which she'd been holding purely as a social prop, barely touched, and saw him. Lee Jae-won. She knew the name the way everyone in Seoul's business world knew the name, the way you know the name of a weather system or a standing geological feature. He was simply there, in the landscape of this city, impossible to ignore and not entirely safe to get too close to. He was tall in a way that felt almost architectural, like his body had been designed with intention, every proportion considered. Broad shoulders sat beneath a charcoal suit jacket worn open over a black shirt with the top two buttons undone, which on a lesser man would have read as trying too hard, but on him read as effortless and faintly dangerous. The tattoos, ink climbing from his wrists, disappearing under fabric, caught the ambient light of the venue in shifting fragments. His hair was dark and polished, layered in a way that looked expensive and controlled, except for one careless section that had fallen forward over his forehead. That one piece of hair was doing a disproportionate amount of work in the room. Women turned. Full rotations. Some subtle, most not. Georgia turned back to her champagne. Her best friend and self-appointed life commentator, Celestine Park, materialized at her elbow the way she always did, suddenly at full volume with strong opinions already loaded. Georgia Renee Hayes, Celestine breathed. Her voice hushed in the way people get when they're looking at something that doesn't feel entirely real. Do you see what just walked into this building? I see a man in a suit, Georgia said. That is not just a man in a suit. That is Lee Jae-won. That is Seoul's most. I know who he is, Celestine. Then why does your face look like you're reading a grocery list? Because I'm here to close a deal. Georgia finally took a sip of the champagne. It was good. She noted that without enthusiasm and set the glass back down. Not to participate in whatever collective hypnosis is happening by the entrance. Celestine turned to look at her with the kind of expression usually reserved for people who claim they don't like music or sleep. Like the problem was too fundamental to unpack right now. You're a unique individual, Celestine said finally. And I mean that with equal parts admiration and genuine concern. Georgia smiled. Quick, private. The kind that lived mostly in her eyes, and smoothed a hand down the front of her outfit. She was wearing a structured cream blazer from her own Hayes Men collection, tailored for women who wanted the architecture of men's fashion without the erasure of their shape, over wide-leg trousers the color of cooled ash. Her chocolate brown wig fell around her shoulders in full, bouncy waves that moved with every turn of her head, a deep glossy sheen catching light the way still water catches sun. She looked, by every available metric, like someone who had not come here to be impressed. She had not come here to be impressed. She was halfway through mentally reconstructing her pitch for the distributor when she became aware of a presence on her left. Not heard. Not seen. Aware of. She turned. He was closer than she'd expected, which was the first calculated thing about the whole approach. The deliberate compression of personal space, just enough to register, not enough to be rude. Up close. The effect of him was even more. She searched privately for a word that wasn't embarrassing and settled on substantial. He was substantial, like standing near something that has its own gravitational field. He looked at her with dark eyes that held an expression she'd seen on the faces of men who were used to being the most interesting thing in any given room, and had never once been given a reason to doubt it. Lee Jae-won, he said, and the way he said his own name was so completely absent of pretense or preamble that it functioned almost like a challenge. Here I am. Your move. Georgia looked at him for exactly 3 measured seconds. Georgia Hayes, she said, matching his energy note for note. Then she turned back to the room. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 2 full heartbeats. I don't think we've met, he said. We haven't. I'd remember. She turned back to him. Her expression was calm the way a locked door is calm. Not hostile, just completely, serenely closed. Is that a line? She said. Or are you just narrating? Something shifted in his face. Not offense, he was too composed for that. More like the sensation of reaching for a railing that wasn't there. I was going to offer to get you a drink, he said. I have one. I noticed it's been full for 20 minutes. She regarded him. You've been watching my drink for 20 minutes. I've been watching you for 20 minutes, he said, and he said it the way men say things when they know the honesty of it will land like a slow-burn compliment, wrapped in enough confidence that it can't be called desperate. Georgia smiled at him. It was a polite smile, professionally warm smile, the smile of a woman closing a chapter. That's flattering, she said, genuinely, but I'm working tonight, and I'm not interested. She picked up her champagne glass, tilted it slightly in a gesture that was both acknowledgement and farewell, and said, Enjoy your evening, with the clean finality of someone turning off a light, and then she walked away, not quickly, not with the self-conscious energy of someone retreating. She walked the way she always walked, like the floor existed specifically to be walked on, and she was simply doing it the courtesy. Across the room, she found the distributor, extended her hand, smiled the real smile this time, warm, expansive, full of the particular brightness she reserved for people she was genuinely trying to reach, and began her pitch. Behind her, she did not look back. She didn't need to. Lee Jae-won stood exactly where she'd left him for 4 full seconds, which was 4 seconds longer than he'd stood anywhere without moving in recent memory. His assistant, Hyun Seo, who had been hovering at a professional distance all evening with the quiet efficiency of someone who had long since accepted that his job description defied clean categorization, materialized at his shoulder. Sir, Hyun Seo said, in a tone that communicated several things simultaneously while technically communicating nothing. Don't, Jae-won said. I didn't say anything. You were about to. Hyun Seo looked at the middle distance. She did just. I know what she did. Jae-won picked up a glass of something from a passing tray. He didn't look at what it was, and turned slightly to find her in the room again. She was already deep in conversation with a middle-aged distributor, laughing at something, one hand gesturing with the clean confidence of someone who knew her product inside out. The chocolate-brown waves of her hair caught the chandelier light as she tilted her head, and something in that specific movement, that specific tilt, lodged itself somewhere in his chest like a splinter. No one had ever walked away from him like that. Not with indifference. Not with that particular brand of "you are not the main event of this evening" energy. Women came to him. That was simply the architecture of his life. They called. They angled for introductions. They laughed a little too brightly in rooms where they knew he might be present. He was not arrogant about it. He simply accepted it as one accepts weather. It was the climate he lived in. This woman had looked at him like he was a cloud she'd decided not to carry an umbrella for. He took a slow sip from the glass in his hand. It was sparkling water. He set it back down. Who is she? He asked. Georgia Hayes, Hyun Seo said, already pulling up something on his phone with the reflex speed of a man who had learned never to be unprepared. American, 26. Founder and creative director of Hayes Men. Men's clothing label, mid to luxury positioning. Been operating out of Seoul for about 2 years. Started in New York. Before that, a fashion design program she apparently funded herself by working 3 jobs simultaneously. A pause. Her most recent collection sold out its pre-order in 4 hours. Jae-won said nothing for a long moment. She's been in Seoul 2 years, he said. Yes, sir. And I've never seen her before tonight. She doesn't typically attend this circuit. Tonight is reportedly an exception. She needs a specific distribution partner. Hyunseo glanced up. She also, according to 3 separate sources I've cross-referenced in the last 90 seconds, does not date people in her industry. Jae-won turned to look at his assistant with an expression that Hyunseo had catalogued under "this will become my problem." I didn't ask about her dating life, Jae-won said. No, Hyunseo agreed. But you were about to. Celestine found Georgia by the hors d'oeuvres table 40 minutes later, looking triumphant in the quiet, internal way Georgia did everything. Like victory was a private room she kept for herself. I closed it, Georgia said without preamble. The deal. Good. Celestine loaded a small plate with 3 different things and pointed one at Georgia. Now can we discuss the fact that you rejected Lee Jae-won to his face in front of half of Seoul's fashion and investment circuit, walked away, and then apparently proceeded to have the most productive 20 minutes of your professional quarter? I didn't reject him, Georgia said. I redirected him. Babes. Celestine put the plate down. He watched your glass for 20 minutes. Which is a little strange if you think about it. Which is romantic if you're a normal human person. I am a normal human person with a distribution deal and a sample shipment to sort out by Thursday. Georgia finally ate something, one of the small rice crackers, and nodded approvingly. These are actually good. Celestine stared at her. You know what you are? Celestine said. Efficient. A force of nature wearing a very beautiful wig. She shook her head slowly. That man has never been told no in his life. I genuinely believe that. I believe he came out of the womb and the doctor said congratulations before he even asked. Georgia laughed. Sudden, surprised, the real one. And the sound of it moved through her chest like something warm being loosened. He'll survive, she said. Across the room, through the shifting constellations of bodies in expensive clothing, Lee Jae-won stood with a glass he wasn't drinking from, watching her laugh at something her friend had said. His jaw was set. His eyes were very, very focused. He had the look of a man who had just decided something. Something had just begun. Neither of them would have agreed on what to call it yet. But it had begun. The second time Georgia Hayes crossed paths with Lee Jae-won, she knew immediately that it wasn't an accident. She just couldn't prove it. Yet, it was a Tuesday morning, which was her most sacred professional hour. The window between 7 and 10 a.m. where she moved through her studio on Mapogu's quieter side street with the focused, unhurried intensity of someone doing the thing they were built for. The studio smelled like fabric sizing and fresh coffee, and the faint cedar of the storage shelving along the back wall. Morning light came through the wide windows at an angle that turned everything the color of warm honey. Bolts of fabric were stacked and tagged along one side. Her current collection's technical sketches were pinned to the long corkboard that ran the full length of the eastern wall, charcoal lines, color swatches, measurement notations in her own cramped, decisive handwriting. She was standing at the cutting table in a slouchy rust-orange crewneck and high-waisted black trousers, her wig pinned up and away from her face in a loose topknot while she worked, when Celestine arrived with 2 coffees and the expression of someone carrying both caffeine and intelligence. There's a man outside, Celestine said. Georgia didn't look up from the fabric she was marking. There are many men outside. It's a public street. There is one specific man outside who is standing next to a matte black car that is aggressively understated for how expensive it obviously is, holding, and I need you to hear this part, flowers. Georgia's hand paused on the fabric marker for exactly half a second. Then she continued marking. Not my flowers, she said. He's looking at the studio door. People look at things. Georgia. Celestine. A beat. It's him, Celestine said. Georgia set down the marker, straightened, and rolled her shoulders back with the composure of someone deciding how to lift something heavy. Then she walked to the window and looked. It was him. Lee Jae-won was standing on the pavement outside her studio with the casual, unapologetic confidence of a man who had decided that public space was simply wherever he chose to be standing. He was in dark trousers and a fitted navy jacket, no tie, collar open, looking like he'd arrived from somewhere important and was about to go somewhere more important, and had simply decided to be here in between. In his left hand, held with the same careless ease with which he seemed to hold most things, was a bunch of flowers. deep amber ranunculus and pale ivory stems, wrapped in brown paper, bound with simple twine. Not a florist's elaborate arrangement. Something that had been selected with more thought than spectacle. Georgia stared at the flowers for a moment longer than she intended to. Then she put her marker back in its tray, smoothed her crew neck and walked to the door. She opened it. He turned. The half-smile arrived first. That slow, unhurried thing that moved across his face like he had all the time in the world and knew it. "You knew I'd be here," she said. "Not a question." "You're always here on Tuesday mornings," he said. "You arrive at 7:03. You order coffee at 8:15 from the place 2 doors down. Oat milk, no sugar, whatever seasonal flavor they have. You don't take meetings before 10. He paused. "Your assistant posts your studio hours on the Hayes Men website." Georgia leaned her shoulder against the doorframe, crossed her arms, and looked at him with the same measured, unreadable patience she used in boardrooms where men underestimated her. "So you researched me," she said. "I paid attention," he corrected, "to information that was publicly available. To you." She let the silence sit there for a moment. Not uncomfortable, just deliberate. Then she looked at the flowers. "I'm not going to take those," she said. "They're not a transaction," he said. "They're just flowers." "Nothing from you is just anything," she said. "That's the problem with men like you. Everything is a move." He tilted his head slightly. Something behind his eyes shifted. Not offended, not deflated, more like a recalibration. Like he was genuinely thinking about what she'd said rather than constructing a counter. "What if I told you," he said slowly, "that I've never had to make moves before, that this is actually a pause?" Something almost vulnerable flickered across his face, just for a second, before the composure closed back over it like water over a stone. New territory. Georgia studied him. She had a very good internal system for detecting performance. She'd built it over years of being underestimated and overcharmed in equal measure. It was calibrated and reliable. It was, right now, returning slightly complicated results. "You've never had to try," she said. "No. And you want me to find that charming?" "I want you to find it honest," he said. Another silence. Longer this time. Then something moved in George's expression. Not a crack, nothing so dramatic. More like a seam. The smallest acknowledgement that this man was sharper and less predictable than his reputation had suggested. She reached out and took the flowers. Not warmly, with the brisk efficiency of someone accepting a package. But she took them. "You have 5 minutes," she said, stepping back from the doorway. Not quite an invitation. Provisional clearance. He walked in. Inside the studio, J1 moved the way people move when they're trying very hard not to look like they're absorbing everything, which meant he was absorbing everything. His eyes tracked the corkboard, the stacked fabric, the sketches, the precise organized chaos of a creative mind that knew exactly where everything was even when it looked scattered. Celestine, who had positioned herself behind the pattern table with a coffee and zero intention of leaving, watched him with the focused attention of a wildlife documentarian. He stopped in front of the corkboard. "This is the new collection?" he asked. The one that sold out pre-order in 4 hours." Georgia set the flowers on the edge of the cutting table and returned to her work. "You did your research. I told you. I paid attention." He turned from the board and looked at her directly. The directness was one of his more disarming qualities. Most powerful people looked slightly past you, at the space where their next interest was forming. He looked at you fully, like you were the most relevant thing in the current landscape. "Your work is exceptional." "I know," she said, without inflection. Celestine inhaled sharply behind her coffee cup and looked at the ceiling to avoid laughing. J1 blinked once. Then, and this was the thing that Georgia clocked without meaning to, he smiled. Not the slow, performative smile from the night of the event. Something smaller, realer, like he'd been caught off guard by delight. "I like that," he said. "Most men don't. I'm not most men." "Every man who is not most men says that," Georgia said, finally looking up at him. "It has never once been a unique observation. You know what's actually unique? Men who show up differently. Not men who say they show up differently." The room held that for a moment. J1 pulled out the stool from under the corner workbench, not asking permission, but not presumptuous about it either. some precise calibration between the two, and sat down. He leaned his forearms on his knees. The jacket pulled slightly across his shoulders. The fallen strand of hair was doing its usual thing across his forehead. "Then let me show up differently," he said. Georgia set her fabric marker down for the second time that morning. She turned fully to face him. Celestine had gone very still in the way she went still when something was about to happen, and she wanted full sensory recording of it. "You want to pursue me?" Georgia said. "Yes. Despite the fact that I told you no. You told me you weren't interested," he said. "Which I respect. But I also think you think it's a challenge. I think," he said carefully, "that you're the most interesting person I've been in a room with in a very long time, and I don't want to let that go without knowing if there's something there." Georgia looked at him for a long, steady moment. Then she did something he hadn't predicted. She laughed. Not the polite, defusing kind. A real laugh, short, incredulous, the kind that escapes before you've decided whether to release it. "Okay," she said. He blinked. "Okay. You want a chance?" She tilted her head, and that movement, the one he'd catalogued at the event without meaning to, arrived again, and something in his chest registered it the same way it had the first time, like a note struck on an instrument he hadn't known he was carrying. "I'll give you one. Exactly 4 weeks. Starting now." She held up 4 fingers. "If you can make me fall for you in 4 weeks, genuinely actually fall, not perform falling, then fine. You win." He stared at her. "And if you can't," she continued, calm as a prepared statement, "you leave me alone. Completely. No follow-ups. No flowers on a Tuesday. No showing up at my door with that face." "With what face?" "That face," she said, gesturing vaguely at all of him. Celestine made a sound behind her coffee cup that she converted, barely, into a cough. J1 held George's gaze. Something was moving behind his eyes, not calculation, not the automatic confidence of a man who didn't know how to lose. Something more complex than that. The beginning, maybe, of genuine want. The kind that arrives before the mind can organize it into strategy. "For weeks," he said. "For weeks." He stood up from the stool, straightened his jacket, looked at her with the full, unguarded weight of his attention. "Done," he said. He walked to the door, paused in the frame, hand on the edge, and looked back over his shoulder, and for just a moment, with the morning light coming in from the street behind him and that one piece of hair falling across his forehead, he looked less like Seoul's most powerful bachelor and more like a man standing at the edge of something he hadn't mapped. "For what it's worth," he said, "I'm going to win." Georgia had already turned back to her fabric. "Everyone thinks that," she said pleasantly. "Until they don't." The door closed. The studio was quiet for approximately 4 seconds. Then Celestine stood up from behind the pattern table, knocked over her coffee, caught it, barely, pointed at the door, pointed at Georgia, and opened her mouth. "Not a word," Georgia said. "I have several words." "Celestine." He said that face, Georgia. He said with that face like he already knows what his face does to people and is mildly embarrassed about it. "I'm working. You gave Lee J1 a dare." Celestine spread both hands wide. "You are a woman who looked at Seoul's most wanted man and said sure, but you've got a month. Set the timer. Do you understand how unhinged that is?" "In the most magnificent possible way." Georgia picked up the amber ranunculus from the edge of the cutting table. She looked at them for a moment. Just a moment, private and unguarded. Then she carried them to the back shelf and set them in the empty glass vase near the window, where the morning light hit them at that particular honey-warm angle. She said nothing, but she didn't throw them out. Celestine saw this, filed it away, said absolutely nothing about it, which cost her more than she would ever admit. That afternoon, J1 sat in the back seat of the car on the way to a meeting he could have rescheduled without consequence and stared at nothing in particular through the window. For weeks, he'd accepted the terms without flinching, which was accurate to how he operated. He didn't negotiate timelines when he was certain of outcomes. And he was almost always certain of outcomes. Almost. He turned the variable over in his mind the way you turn a coin. Not nervously, just repetitively, feeling for the weight of it. She had taken the flowers. She had given him a door, slim and provisional as it was. She had laughed, and that laugh, unguarded and quick and genuinely surprised out of her, had told him more about her in 2 seconds than most people's carefully curated performances told him in an hour. She wasn't uninterested. She was defended. There was a difference. He understood defended. He lived in a version of it himself, though he'd never examined it closely enough to name it. Hyun-seo, he said. His assistant looked up from the front passenger seat. I need to know everything she loves, Jae-won said. Not what she's known for professionally. What she loves. Food. Routines. What she does on weekends. What matters to her when no one is watching. Hyun-seo made a note. He had the expression of a man who had just seen the opening chapter of something long. And, Jae-won added, almost as an afterthought, almost, cooking classes. Find me the best one in the city. A pause. You want to take a cooking class, Hyun-seo said. I want to take the best one. Sir, with respect. Last year you tried to make ramen in the penthouse and the building's fire suppression system. Find me the class, Hyun-seo. Hyun-seo turned back to his phone with the quiet resignation of a man who had made peace with his life choices. In the window's reflection, barely visible, Jae-won was almost smiling. For weeks, one mission. One woman who had built walls so well she'd forgotten to leave a door. He was going to find it anyway. The cooking class was held in a narrow, warm-lit kitchen studio in Yongsan, run by a woman named Chef Bora who was approximately 5 feet tall, 62 years old, and possessed zero tolerance for incompetence regardless of the net worth attached to it. Jae-won arrived on a Wednesday evening in a fitted black Henley and dark trousers, flanked briefly by Hyun-seo, who handed him an apron at the door with the solemnity of someone passing off a relay baton in a race they personally had no interest in running. The other participants are home cooks, Hyun-seo said. Hobbyists. You should know that going in. That's fine. One of them is a retired postal worker named Mr. Kwon, who has apparently been attending for 3 years. Also fine. Chef Bora has a policy about phones. What policy? Away. Completely. No exceptions. Hyun-seo paused with the careful neutrality of a man delivering news about a natural disaster. She confiscated a Chable Airs device last spring and did not return it until the end of the session. Jae-won looked at the apron in his hands. It was pale yellow with a small embroidered radish near the hem. He put it on. Go home, he told Hyun-seo. I'll be in the car. Go home. Hyun-seo went to the car. The first session lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes, which Jae-won would later describe to no one, because he told no one about this, as the most humbling experience of his adult life. It wasn't that he was bad in a simple, correctable way. It was that he was bad in a manner that suggested a foundational disconnect between his hands and any reasonable culinary intention. He burned the garlic in the first 7 minutes. Not singed, not overbrowned, carbonized. While Mr. Kwon next to him produced a perfectly golden, fragrant base that smelled like something's grandmother had made it. Chef Bora appeared at his elbow with the quiet materialization of someone who had seen every category of kitchen disaster and had stopped being surprised approximately a decade ago. She looked at the pan. She looked at him. You've never cooked before, she said. Not unkindly. Forensically. I've reheated things. That is not cooking. She removed the pan with a swift, practiced motion, set it aside, and handed him a clean one. We start again. Smaller flame. You're not trying to punish the food. You're trying to talk to it. Mr. Kwon, without looking up from his own station, nodded with the slow gravity of someone confirming a life philosophy. Jae-won started again. By the end of the session, his dish was technically edible. Chef Bora described it as showing early signs of effort, which in her vocabulary, he gathered from the other participants' reactions, was roughly equivalent to a standing ovation. He drove home at 10:15 p.m. smelling like scorched sesame oil and something vaguely hopeful. He came back on Friday, and the following Wednesday, and the Friday after that. By the end of the second week, he could make a clean, properly seasoned doenjang jjigae. Mr. Kwon tasted it, made a sound of moderate approval, and said your knife work is still emotional, which was the most useful critique Jae-won had received about anything in recent memory. He practiced in the penthouse kitchen on the nights between classes, standing at the marble counter in a plain t-shirt with his sleeves pushed up, ink visible along his forearms, following handwritten notes he'd taken during sessions with the same concentrated precision he brought to acquisition briefs. His housekeeper, Mrs. O, who had worked for him for 4 years and had never once seen him operate the stove, stood in the kitchen doorway on the third night of this and simply watched in silence for a full minute before deciding she had witnessed enough and going to bed. He wasn't cooking to perform. He was cooking because Georgia loved it. Loved it the way people love things that restore them, the way she apparently moved through her kitchen on Sunday mornings like the rest of the week's weight lifted off her shoulders with every pot she lifted. He'd learned this from 3 different sources, none of them intrusive. A profile interview she'd done for a Korean design magazine 8 months ago, an offhand comment her brand's social media had captured at a pop-up event, and Celestine, who, he was increasingly convinced, was the most unwittingly generous intelligence source he had ever encountered, simply because she narrated George's life at full volume in public spaces and apparently saw no reason to stop. He wasn't cooking to impress her. He was cooking to understand her, to stand inside the thing she loved and feel what she felt there. That distinction, had he examined it at the time, would have told him something important about where this was already going. He wasn't examining it yet. The dog arrived on a Thursday. His name was Biscuit. This was not J1's choice. This was the name the shelter had given him and which, according to the shelter coordinator, a cheerful woman named Ms. Lim who seemed genuinely thrilled to be placing a dog with someone who filled out the adoption paperwork wearing a suit. He had responded to consistently and with enthusiasm, so changing it would be confusing for his development. J1 had said fine. Biscuit was a golden retriever, 14 months old, floppy-eared, with the specific kind of wholehearted, unconditional energy that operates without asking permission. He entered the penthouse at full velocity, slid on the polished floor, recovered without embarrassment, and immediately put his nose into every corner of the space with the investigative enthusiasm of someone who had been waiting their whole life for this assignment. J1 stood in the middle of his living room and watched this. Then his eyes started watering. Then his nose. He'd known, abstractly going into this, that he was allergic to dogs. He'd been allergic since childhood, not severely, not in any life-threatening sense, but persistently and inconveniently, the kind of allergy that announces itself with itchy eyes and a general sense of betrayal from his own immune system. He had done the research. Antihistamines, air purifiers, he'd ordered 3, the best available, installed in the main rooms before Biscuit arrived. He had a standing prescription refill organized. He had, at Hyunseo's suggestion, also purchased a very expensive robotic vacuum that ran on a schedule. What he had not fully accounted for was Biscuit himself. Specifically the fact that Biscuit had opinions about personal space, and those opinions were that it did not exist and should not exist, and that the correct distance between himself and a human he had decided to love was 0 centimeters. By Thursday evening, J1 was sitting on his couch with a sneeze that had arrived in a series of 5, antihistamine taken, air purifier humming, Biscuit's enormous warm head resting directly on his thigh with the settled confidence of someone who had found their place in the world and intended to stay there. J1 looked down at him. Biscuit looked up. His tail moved slowly. His eyes, warm and amber brown, held the specific expression of a creature operating on pure, uncomplicated affection. Something in J1's chest did a thing he didn't have immediate vocabulary for. "Don't get comfortable," he told Biscuit. Biscuit's tail moved faster. J1 reached down, slowly, like a man making a concession he hadn't fully approved, and scratched behind one floppy ear. He texted Hyunseo at 9 p.m. "Order more antihistamines. The bulk option." Hyunseo replied, "Already done, sir. Also, Mr. Kwan from the cooking class sent a note asking if you'd like to join the advanced session." J1 stared at this message for a moment. Then he put his phone face down on the cushion. Biscuit sneezed on his trouser leg. "Fantastic," J1 said. He did not move. The Saturday volunteer shift at the Mapo Youth Arts Center was the one that changed things. Not dramatically. Not in a way he could have pointed to and said that's when it shifted. But it shifted. He'd found out about the center the same way he'd found out about the cooking. Attention paid across multiple small details that assembled themselves into a picture. Georgia gave every Saturday morning, 8 to noon, consistent as weather. She didn't post about it. There was no brand angle, no PR value. She went because she wanted to go, because she believed in the specific and irreplaceable thing that happens when a child is given material and space and someone who takes their creative instinct seriously. J1 showed up at 8:15 on a gray Seoul Saturday with no announcement. No Hyunseo, No preparation beyond having called the center director the previous week to ask if additional volunteers were needed and receiving an enthusiastic yes. He wore a plain dark sweatshirt, jeans, hair not styled, or rather, styled in the unstudied way it fell when he hadn't touched it, which was arguably more devastating, but that was not the current point. Georgia was already there when he arrived. She was sitting on a low stool at a table with 4 children between the ages of roughly 8 and 12, helping one of them, a small, serious-faced girl with paint already on both elbows, figure out why her watercolor was muddying in the center of the paper. She heard the door, looked up. The expression that crossed her face was not the cool, composed neutrality she deployed at the fashion event. It wasn't the brisk, measured engagement of the studio. It was something quicker and less managed, a flicker of genuine surprise, with something underneath it that she shuddered before it could be read clearly. "You're here," she said. "You needed volunteers," he said. The director confirmed. She looked at him for a long moment. That particular look she had, the one that felt like being read rather than seen, like she was checking for the seams in a thing to find out if it was real. Then she nodded once and pointed to the table at the far end, where a boy of about 10 was staring at a blank canvas with the expression of someone facing down a personal enemy. "His name is Taeyong," she said. "He wants to paint his grandmother's hands but doesn't know how to start. Help him figure it out." Jae-won walked to the table and sat down. He had no formal art knowledge. He told Taeyong this immediately, which made the boy look at him with renewed interest, the way children respond to adults who don't perform competence they don't have. "Then how do we do it?" Taeyong asked. "I don't know yet," Jae-won said. "Let's figure it out." They spent 40 minutes on it, starting with Taeyong describing his grandmother's hands in words, which Jae-won listened to with the full, undivided weight of his attention, asking questions, drawing out detail. "What do they feel like when she holds yours? Where are the lines deepest? What color is her skin in the kitchen light?" By the time they moved to the canvas, Taeyong had so much to work from that the painting began almost by itself. At one point Georgia passed behind them and slowed down. She looked at the canvas, looked at Jae-won, who was leaning forward on his forearms pointing at something on the page and talking to Taeyong in a low, even voice. She didn't say anything, but she slowed down, and she didn't look away for a few seconds longer than necessary. Soul lovers, if you're loving this story, kindly hit the like button and share with someone who loves a Rivals to Lovers story, and if you're new to the channel, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss when the next incredible story drops. And tell me in the comments, what country are you watching from and what time is it where you are? I love hearing from you all. Now back to the story. On the way out at noon, walking through the light that had shifted from gray to the particular pale gold of a Seoul winter morning making its best effort, Georgia fell into step beside him on the pavement without quite meaning to. "You didn't tell anyone you were coming," she said. "No. No cameras. No post. Nothing. That's not why I came." She was quiet for half a block. Their breath made small clouds in the cold air. Biscuit, who Jae-won had left at the penthouse today, partly because he was still negotiating their relationship, and partly because bringing a dog to a children's art center felt like showing your whole hand, was probably currently destroying something expensive. "Taeyong's painting was good," she said. "It was his," Jae-won said. "I just asked questions." Georgia looked sideways at him. Just briefly. "That," she said, "is actually the whole job." She peeled off at the corner. Her studio was 3 blocks east. She had afternoon work. She had always had afternoon work, and he watched her go, the chocolate brown waves moving against the back of her coat with every step, unhurried, fully herself. Something in his chest was doing that thing again. He took an antihistamine, though Biscuit wasn't nearby, which suggested the allergy had expanded its territory somewhat. He walked back to the car. He had 2.5 weeks left. For the first time since accepting the terms of a dare, he'd been certain he would win with ease. He felt something that wasn't certainty. Something that was considerably more interesting than certainty. Something that felt, if he was being precise about it, and he was always precise, uncomfortably close to stakes. He'd arrived in her life as a challenge. He was starting, quietly, without permission, to become something else entirely. The first sign was the playlist. Georgia noticed it on a Monday evening, 11 days into the 4 weeks, when she was in her studio after hours doing the kind of work that only happens when the rest of the world has gone home. The quiet, unhurried kind, where the decisions come cleaner and the creative instinct moves without interference. She was repinning a revised sketch to the corkboard when her phone buzzed on the cutting table. Not a call. A share notification. A playlist, sent from a number she'd saved under Lee J1. Do not be charmed. No message attached. Just the playlist. She stared at the notification for longer than she intended. Then she put the phone face down and finished pinning the sketch. Then she picked the phone back up. The playlist was called for when you're working late. It had 41 songs. She scrolled through them slowly, her expression doing something complicated in the empty studio. Old school R&B she hadn't heard since college, Sod, Music Soul Child, and Erykah Badu deep cut she was almost certain had never appeared on any algorithm's recommendation. Interspersed between them, unhurried and intentional, Korean indie tracks she didn't recognize but which turned out, when she pressed play on the first one, to have the same warm, introspective quality as everything else he'd selected. At the very bottom of the playlist, the last track, a song her mother used to play on Sunday mornings in their apartment in Brooklyn. She hadn't mentioned that song to anyone in Seoul. She hadn't mentioned it to him. She stood in the middle of her studio with her phone in both hands and the music playing softly through the speaker on the shelf, and she thought, carefully and deliberately, about how he could possibly have known. Then she thought about the Design magazine interview she'd done 8 months ago, where she'd mentioned briefly, in passing, one sentence, that her mother's Sunday morning music was the first soundtrack she'd ever associated with making something beautiful. He had read an 8-month-old interview. He had found that one sentence. He had put the song at the end, like a quiet signature. I was paying attention even before I knew I was paying attention. Georgia set her phone down on the cutting table. She pressed both palms flat against the cool surface and breathed out slowly. Okay, she said to the empty room. Soft, private. Not quite a surrender, more like an acknowledgement. The sound of a woman marking a shift she hadn't authorized but couldn't honestly deny. She did not tell Celestine about the playlist that night. She told her 2 days later, which was its own kind of admission. The second sign was the extra portion. Sunday morning, her kitchen. The one space in her soul life that was entirely and unapologetically hers. She'd repainted the walls herself the first month she'd moved in. A deep, warm terracotta that held the morning light like cupped hands. Copper-bottomed pots she'd shipped from home. A cast-iron skillet her grandmother had used before her, seasoned so deeply it was practically part of the family. She cooked on Sunday mornings the way other people meditate. Fully present, unhurried, the week's residue falling away with every careful preparation. This Sunday she was making jollof rice the way her mother taught her, and jerk chicken that took 40 minutes of genuine attention, and fried plantains because it wasn't a full Sunday without them. She was plating the rice when she realized she'd made enough for two. She stood at the counter and looked at the plate. She had not invited anyone. Celestine was in Busan visiting her parents until Tuesday. There was no second person coming. She had simply, without deciding to, cooked as though someone else might be here. She knew whose face had been in the back of her mind while she cooked. She put the extra portion in a container. Told herself it was for lunch tomorrow. Put it in the refrigerator. Stood in front of the closed refrigerator for 3 seconds longer than necessary. Then she went back to her own plate, sat at the kitchen table in the morning light, and ate in the deliberate, private quiet of someone who was very carefully not thinking about something. She was thinking about it the entire time. Celestine came back from Busan on Tuesday and within 4 hours had assembled a complete forensic picture from 3 separate pieces of evidence. The playlist, which Georgia had eventually, reluctantly admitted to, the cooking incident, which Georgia described as a logistical error, and the fact that Georgia had, twice in the past week, checked her phone within 90 seconds of waking up. You check your email first thing, Celestine said. They were in Georgia's kitchen. Celestine on the counter with a bowl of the leftover jollof rice she'd found in the refrigerator. Georgia at the table pretending to review production notes. You have checked your email first thing every morning since I have known you. It is one of your most consistent qualities. You once said, and I'm quoting directly, that email was the only thing worth looking at before 10 a.m. because at least email didn't have feelings. I still believe that. Then why are you checking your messages? Georgia looked up from her notes. I have business messages. At 6:53 in the morning. Business doesn't sleep, Celestine. Celestine pointed her fork at her. His name starts with L and ends in EJ1. Georgia returned to her notes. You're slipping, Celestine said, not unkindly. And I want you to know that I think it's beautiful. I think it's the most beautiful thing I've seen since you opened this studio. I also think you're going to fight it for at least another week before you let yourself feel it without a disclaimer attached. I'm not. You cooked for him. In your head. In your most sacred space. On your most sacred morning. You cooked for a man who wasn't there. Celestine set the bowl down. Her voice was quieter now. The underneath version of her. The one that lived beneath the comedy and came out when something mattered. Georgia. When was the last time you did that? Thought about someone that way without meaning to. Georgia was quiet. It had been a very long time. Long enough that she'd quietly decided the capacity for it might have atrophied. Long enough that she'd built her life around its absence so thoroughly that the architecture of her days had stopped leaving room for it. He's doing it on purpose, she said finally. Yes, Celestine agreed. And somehow that's not the point anymore, is it? It wasn't the point anymore. That was the problem. It had started as a controlled experiment. She'd issued the dare with the cool confidence of someone who knew the outcome in advance, who had examined the variables and assessed the risk and determined that a man like J1, accustomed to everything arriving easily, would last approximately 10 days before his attention drifted to something more immediately rewarding. She had not accounted for the cooking class he attended 3 times a week and spoke of to no one. She found out about it from Mr. Kwan, who turned out to be the uncle of one of her fabric suppliers, who mentioned with genuine warmth that his Wednesday evening class had a new participant who burned everything enthusiastically and took notes between sessions like a graduate student preparing for a final. She had not accounted for Taeyong, who had started asking every Saturday if the tall man with the tattoos was coming back, and who had, on J1's 3rd consecutive Saturday at the center, shown him the finished painting of his grandmother's hands, and received in return a response so genuine and specific that Taeyong had folded it carefully and put it in his coat pocket for the walk home. She had not accounted for the voice note. It arrived on a Thursday, 12 seconds long. No preamble. I made doenjang jjigae tonight without burning anything. Chef Bora said it was acceptable. I think that's the best thing anyone has ever said to me. That was it. No ask. No follow-up. Just a 12-second window into a man who was becoming, incrementally and without announcement, someone different from the person who had walked into that event 2 weeks ago. Georgia had listened to it 3 times. She had not replied, but she had saved it. The crack, when it came, arrived on a Friday evening at a small gallery opening in Insadong that they both attended separately and ended up at together in the way that had stopped feeling like coincidence and started feeling like gravity. She was standing in front of a large abstract canvas. Deep indigo blues bleeding into raw sienna at the edges. A painting that felt less like something to look at and more like something to stand inside. When she heard him behind her, she knew it was him before she turned. The particular quality of his presence in a room had become, over the past 2.5 weeks, something her nervous system had apparently decided to file under significant without consulting her first. It looks like a decision being made, he said, coming to stand beside her, looking at the painting. Not at her. At the painting. She turned to look at him, then back at the canvas. I thought it looked like something ending, she said. Maybe they're the same thing. She considered that. The gallery was warm, low-lit, the kind of lighting that softened the outlines of everything and made conversations feel more honest than they might otherwise. How's Biscuit? She asked. She'd seen a single, uncaptioned photo on Hyun-seo's private Instagram. She followed Hyun-seo for industry updates, she told herself, of a golden retriever occupying what appeared to be the entirety of a very expensive couch. Jae-won's expression shifted into something that was not quite a smile and was significantly more endearing for it. Deeply committed to making my life difficult, he said. Structurally, we have reached an understanding. Immunologically, I'm still negotiating. You're still keeping him, she said. Even with the allergy. Yes. Why? He turned to look at her then. Directly. The full weight of it. Because he matters to you. And things that matter to you have started to matter to me. The gallery hummed softly around them. Somewhere behind them a glass was set down. A conversation rose and subsided. Georgia looked at him for a long, unguarded moment. Longer than she'd allowed herself before. Longer than the measured, calibrated glances she'd rationed across the past weeks. She looked at the tiredness around his eyes that wasn't defeat but effort. Genuine, consistent, quiet effort. She looked at the strand of hair across his forehead. She looked at his hands, relaxed at his sides, the ink at his wrists just visible below his cuff. Something in her chest moved. Not dramatically, not like a wall coming down, like a door, long locked, finding that the mechanism had quietly, without permission, begun to give. J1, she said, his name unadorned. First time without the last name's professional distance. Something in his expression changed when she said it. Subtle, like a breath taken carefully. I need you to know, she said, measured and honest in the way she did everything, that I didn't expect you. I didn't expect you either, he said. And the way he said it, low, direct, carrying the weight of something that had arrived and rearranged things, told her that he wasn't talking about the bet anymore. Hadn't been for a while. They stood there in front of the painting that looked like a decision being made or something ending, or maybe both. And then someone from the gallery's hosting team appeared at J1's elbow to greet him, and the moment folded, not broken, just paused, like a sentence interrupted mid-clause, the meaning suspended in the air between them, waiting. Georgia took a slow breath. She drifted toward the next canvas. But she carried the unfinished sentence with her for the rest of the evening, and when she got home and sat on her kitchen floor with a cup of tea going cold in her hands, she did not try to put it down. She let herself hold it. For the first time, she let herself hold it without a disclaimer. 3 weeks had passed. 1 remained, but the countdown had stopped feeling like a clock. It had started feeling like a consequence. Neither of them was ready. Both of them already knew. The last week arrived without ceremony. No dramatic shift in weather. No symbolic sign. Just a Wednesday morning that looked like every other Wednesday morning. Georgia's studio, the corkboard, the fabric, the coffee from 2 doors down. Except that everything inside it felt slightly different. The way a room feels different when you know you're leaving it soon. Charged with its own significance. More itself than usual. She was on a call with her New York production partner when J1's name appeared as a notification on her screen. Not a message. A photo. She let it sit there until the call ended. Then she opened it. It was Biscuit, sitting in what she recognized as J1's penthouse kitchen. She'd seen enough of it in incidental backgrounds by now to know its clean, pale marble geometry, wearing a miniature apron. The apron was yellow. It had a small embroidered radish near the hem. It was identical to the one J1 wore in his cooking class. She stared at the photo. She pressed her lips together very firmly. She did not smile. She failed completely at not smiling. She put the phone face down on the cutting table and stood with both hands pressed to her cheeks like a woman trying to hold her own face together, which was in fact precisely what she was doing. The smile stayed for longer than she had authorized. He called her that evening. Not a text, not a voice note, a call which felt, in the current landscape of their communication, like a deliberate escalation, something chosen rather than defaulted to. She answered on the 3rd ring, which was 2 rings later than the first ring she'd almost answered on. I need to tell you something, he said. No preamble. His voice was different on the phone. The slight remove of it stripped away some of the composed, architectural quality and left something more immediate underneath. Okay, she said. She was sitting cross-legged on her kitchen counter the way she did when conversations required her to be physically grounded, back against the upper cabinet, a glass of water she wasn't drinking in her hand. I'm going to tell you something that isn't part of the bet, he said. It has nothing to do with the 4 weeks or the dare or any of that. I need you to hear it separately from all of that. Can you do that? Her hand tightened slightly around the glass. I'm listening. I was at a dinner 2 nights ago, he said. Industry thing. One of the investors there mentioned your label, mentioned it as a case study for independent brand scaling in the Korean market. He was using it as a positive example, something he was going to reference in a panel discussion. A pause. 3 other people at the table hadn't heard of Hayes Men. By the time I was done talking, they had. Georgia was quiet. I didn't do it strategically, he said. I didn't do it to impress you or to earn something. I did it because someone was talking about your work and not saying nearly enough, and I apparently, a beat like he was choosing the next words carefully, have a lot of feelings about that. The kitchen was very quiet around her. Outside, Seoul moved through its evening, indifferent and continuous. Inside, something in Georgia's chest was doing something she had stopped trying to name and simply started allowing. "You advocated for my brand," she said, "to investors, without telling me." "Yes. Why are you telling me now?" "Because I don't want anything between us that isn't honest," he said, "including the things I do when you're not watching." She set the water glass down very carefully on the counter beside her. "J1, she said. "I know," he said quietly, like he already knew what she was feeling, like he'd felt it arrive in his own chest first and had been waiting for it to reach her. They stayed on the line in silence for a moment. Not empty silence, but the kind that's full of everything that words would only approximate. "I'll see you Saturday," she said finally. "Saturday," he agreed. She ended the call. Sat on her counter in the quiet kitchen with the terracotta walls holding the low evening light. Thought about walls. About what it actually takes to build them. All the accumulated decisions, the small daily choices to stay defended, the practiced art of needing no one enough to be safe. Thought about what it takes to make someone want to come out from behind them. Not force. Not performance. Just attention. Consistent, patient, specific attention. The kind that says, "I see you." Not the version you present. You. She got down from the counter. Washed the glass. Went to bed. Lay awake for a while. Did not mind. Saturday arrived cold and bright. The sky over Seoul stretched thin and pale as paper. Winter doing its most photogenic work. Georgia got to the art center at 8, same as always. Set up the supply tables. Said good morning to the director, to the other volunteers, to the children who arrived in coats and hats and the particular Saturday morning energy of kids who had chosen to be somewhere rather than been required to be. J1 arrived at 8:15. He was carrying 2 coffees, 1 oat milk, no sugar, seasonal flavor, from the place 2 doors down from her studio. He handed hers over without comment, without the small theater of making sure she noticed the gesture. Just handed it to her the way you hand something to someone whose preferences you know as well as your own. She took it. Their fingers didn't touch. Almost. She went to her table. He went to Taeyang's, which had become, over the past weeks, simply his table. The corner spot with the natural light where Taeyang and 2 other children who had migrated toward the calm consistency of his presence now worked every Saturday morning. Georgia spent the first 40 minutes helping a group of girls with a collage project, but she was aware of him across the room the way you're aware of a fire in your peripheral vision. Not distracted, just perpetually oriented. At one point she heard him laugh. A real one. Surprised out of him by something Taeyang said. Low and genuine and nothing like the polished social sounds she'd heard at the fashion event. It moved through the room like something warm. She looked over. He was already looking at her. Neither of them looked away immediately. After the session, walking out into the pale winter light, he didn't fall into step beside her the way he usually did. He stopped on the pavement just outside the door and turned to face her fully. "The 4 weeks end tomorrow," he said. She nodded. She knew. She'd been aware of the countdown for days in the background of everything. Not dreading it, not anticipating it, more like waiting for the moment when the scaffolding came down and you could see what the building actually was. "I'm not going to ask you to call it," he said. "I'm not going to stand here and present a case or ask you to announce something." He looked at her steadily. The pale winter sun made the ink on his hands visible at his cuffs. "I just want you to know where I am. Clearly. With nothing else attached to it." She waited. "I came into this thinking it was a challenge," he said. "Something to win. Which is, I know how that sounds. I know what kind of man that makes me look like." A slight pause. Not shame, honesty. The kind that costs something. But somewhere in the middle of burning garlic and learning that I apparently cannot be trusted around a cutting board without supervision, and sitting on a floor with a dog I'm allergic to who has decided I'm his person. He stopped. Looked at her in a way that was completely unguarded. No performance. No architecture. Just a man standing in the cold in front of a woman and telling the truth. "I stopped thinking about winning. I stopped thinking about the bet. I just wanted to be near you. Wanted to know you. Wanted to be the kind of person you'd look at without calculating the exit." The street was quiet around them. A distant truck. A bird somewhere above the roofline. Georgia looked at him for a long moment, that full, reading look, checking the seams, finding none. You know what I've never told anyone? She said. He waited. I built everything alone on purpose, she said. Not because I had to, because I decided early that needing people was a variable I couldn't afford. That caring about something you can't control is a structural weakness. She said it clinically, the way you describe something you've examined so many times it's lost its emotional charge. But underneath the clinical framing, he heard it, the specific kind of tiredness that comes from defending something for so long you've forgotten what you were defending against. I made myself very good at not needing things. I know, he said quietly. And then you showed up, she said. With your ridiculous apron and your dog that sneezes on everything and your 12-second voice notes, and you just... She stopped, pressed her lips together. The chocolate-brown waves of her hair moved in the cold air, catching the pale winter light. You paid attention to the parts one never told anyone to pay attention to. And I don't... Her voice dropped slightly. I don't entirely know what to do with that. You don't have to do anything with it, he said. I'm not asking you to restructure anything. I'm just... He exhaled slowly, and his breath clouded in the cold air between them. I'm here, specifically and deliberately and with no version of a backup plan. I'm just here. Georgia looked at him. Something in her chest opened. Not like a door giving way under pressure, not like a collapse. Like a window chosen and lifted. Deliberate. Hers. Your cooking is still terrible, she said. He blinked once. Then that smile arrived, not the slow, performative one from the first night, not the careful, calibrated one from the studio. The real one. The small, unguarded one that reached all the way up. Chef Bora said acceptable. J1. Which in culinary terms is essentially J1. He stopped. She stepped forward. One step, measured and deliberate. Close enough that the space between them became something with its own particular weight. Come cook with me, she said. Sunday morning. My kitchen. He looked at her. The full weight of it, everything he'd been carrying for 4 weeks and beyond. The attention, the wanting, the slow and unprecedented experience of someone maturing more than the mission. Yeah, he said, soft, like the word had been waiting somewhere and finally found its way out. Okay. She showed up at her own door on Sunday morning. He was already there, outside, not presuming entry, standing in the pale early light with Biscuit on a lead. The dog saw her first and lost his mind entirely. A full-body celebration, tail at maximum velocity, enormous paws on the pavement dancing. Georgia crouched down and let Biscuit put his nose against her face, which he did with the complete, absolute commitment of a creature made entirely of affection. She laughed. The real one, the surprised one, the one that escaped before she'd approved it. When she stood, J1 was watching her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Something entirely undefended. Something that had quietly, without announcement, made itself at home on his face and had no interest in leaving. He likes you, J1 said. He likes everyone. No, he said. He really doesn't. She looked at him. He looked at her. Come in, she said. She opened the door. He came in, Biscuit first, immediately and catastrophically interested in the kitchen, and J1 stepped across the threshold of her space, the terracotta walls and copper pots and cast iron skillet and the life she'd built with her own hands, and he looked around at all of it with the quiet reverence of someone who understood that he'd been led into something that not many people got to see. She handed him an apron. It was blue. No embroidered radish. He looked mildly disappointed. Stop it, she said, turning to the counter. I didn't say anything. You were about to. He tied the apron, rolled his sleeves, came to stand beside her at the counter, close, not quite touching, the particular warmth of proximity in a small kitchen on a cold morning. What are we making? He said. Jollof rice, she said, and jerk chicken, and plantains. She looked sideways at him. It takes attention and patience, and you cannot rush any of it. I have been told, he said with complete sincerity, that I am capable of paying attention. She handed him a knife and pointed at the onions. He started chopping. She watched his technique. Taeyong was right, the knife work was emotional, and said nothing, just reached over and adjusted the angle of his grip with one brief, matter-of-fact touch, and then went back to her own prep as though nothing of significance had happened. His hand held the adjusted position for the rest of the morning. They cooked for 2 hours. He burned nothing. She noted this aloud, and he accepted the acknowledgement with the dignity of a man who had practiced for exactly this moment. They talked. Not about the bet, not about the 4 weeks, not about any of the scaffolding that had brought them here. About his grandmother, who had raised him in a small apartment in Nowan before the money came and who he credited, quietly and without performance, for everything he actually valued about himself. About George's mother's Sunday mornings in Brooklyn, the music and the cooking and the specific quality of the light through their apartment windows that she'd been chasing. She realized as she said it aloud, in every space she'd made for herself since. Biscuit fell asleep under the kitchen table. At some point the cooking stopped and the eating began, and then the talking continued around the food, at her kitchen table, in the terracotta morning, winter light coming through the window at that particular honey-warm angle. At some point, she couldn't have said exactly when, the way you can't say exactly when a season changes, only that at some point you look up and it has. His hand was on the table and hers was beside it, and the distance between them was a choice that both of them were making and neither of them was making to keep. She moved her hand. Their fingers met. He looked at her. She looked back, steady and open and completely, deliberately present. Georgia Hayes, who had built every wall with her own hands, who had made herself excellent at not needing, who had issued a dare she'd expected to win easily and had instead found herself on the other side of something she hadn't mapped and no longer wanted to. For the record, she said quietly, you didn't win the bet. He tilted his head slightly. I fell on my own terms, she said. In my own time. In my own kitchen. The corner of her mouth moved. There's a difference. He looked at her. That full, unguarded look. The one she'd been receiving for weeks and had spent weeks pretending not to feel the weight of. Noted, he said, and his thumb moved across the back of her hand. Once, slow and deliberate, and that single motion carried more intention than most people put into entire speeches. Outside, Seoul moved through its Sunday morning, indifferent and continuous and entirely unaware. Inside, in a kitchen that smelled like jollof rice and something beginning, Biscuit snored softly under the table. And 2 people who had arrived in each other's lives as a challenge sat with their hands together in the quiet, neither of them needing to say anything more. Because some things, when they finally arrive, not swept in on a grand gesture, not announced, not performed, settle into place with the particular, unhurried certainty of something that was always going to happen. It just needed someone to pay attention. Celestine found out at approximately 3 p.m. when Georgia sent a single text that read, he stayed for lunch. Celestine, who was in a cafe in Mapo with her laptop and an untouched Americano, read the message, put her phone face down on the table, looked at the ceiling, picked her phone back up, and typed, Georgia Renee Hayes. Georgia replied with one word, don't. Celestine replied with 17 separate emojis, a voice note that was mostly incoherent, and then a final text that said simply, I knew. I knew from the flowers. I knew from the Tuesday you didn't throw them out. I knew the whole time. Georgia didn't reply to that one, but she was smiling when she read it. And across the city, in a terracotta kitchen, with a golden retriever asleep under the table and a man washing dishes at the sink while she revised production notes at the table, and the afternoon light turned everything gold and unhurried and completely, thoroughly real, she was still smiling. If this story moved something in you, made you laugh, made you feel, subscribe right now if you haven't. Turn on notifications, because the next one is already coming and you do not want to be late. Drop your country and your local time in the comments. Every single one. Let's see how far this story has traveled tonight.